I have watched enough wars to recognize the moment when strategy quietly fails and endurance takes over, and that moment arrived in Ukraine long before Washington was willing to admit it. Early commentary framed this conflict as a contest of maneuver, morale, and territorial control, as if decisive breakthroughs were just one weapons package away. That framing was never grounded in serious intelligence analysis. By mid 2022, the battlefield reality was already clear to anyone willing to look past press releases. This war had settled into an attritional struggle defined by artillery expenditure, drone saturation, industrial replenishment, and the ability to absorb losses over time. Trenches, minefields, layered defenses, and incremental advances replaced sweeping offensives. Progress was measured in meters, not maps. That was not a temporary phase, it was the character of the war itself. The intelligence failure was not a lack of data. Satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and open source reporting all showed the same picture. Russian forces adapted their defenses, expanded drone usage, and leaned on massed fires. Ukrainian forces, constrained by manpower and ammunition, shifted toward defensive fortifications and precision strikes. The distortion occurred when policymakers demanded intelligence that supported continued escalation narratives rather than assessments that reflected operational limits. Analysts who warned that industrial capacity and logistics would dominate were sidelined in favor of those who promised momentum. The strategic consequence of this distortion was predictable. Western policy continued to chase battlefield turning points that no longer existed, pouring resources into a framework built on outdated assumptions. Aid packages were calibrated to political timelines rather than to the realities of production cycles and sustainment. Meanwhile, Russia adjusted its economy and military posture for a long war, accepting sanctions as a cost rather than a deterrent. The endurance gap widened quietly while public messaging insisted the opposite. From an intelligence standpoint, this is textbook narrative capture. When leadership defines success in rhetorical terms, intelligence becomes a validation tool instead of an analytic one. Endurance wars are won by societies that can align strategy with reality, not by those that confuse resolve with capability. The hard lesson here is simple and uncomfortable. Once a conflict becomes a war of endurance, wishful thinking is not just wrong, it is strategically lethal. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, when intelligence is bent to fit policy? I spent enough years inside the intelligence system to know the difference between bad intelligence and corrupted intelligence. What unfolded as this war dragged on was not an absence of information, but a systematic bending of analysis to fit policy decisions already made. By late 2022, the core assessments coming out of Washington were no longer asking what was happening on the battlefield. They were asking how to justify the next tranche of aid, the next escalation step, the next public claim that victory was still within reach. Intelligence, in effect, was reverse engineered. The distortion followed a familiar pattern. Raw data showed static front lines, soaring artillery expenditure, growing manpower strain on Ukraine, and Russian adaptation to Western weapons systems. Drone warfare intensified, air defenses were saturated, and logistics hubs became prime targets on both sides. None of this suggested imminent collapse on either side. Yet finished intelligence products increasingly emphasized selective successes while downplaying attritional realities. Worst-case scenarios were labeled as low confidence, while optimistic projections were framed as plausible futures. This was not deception in the cinematic sense. It was institutional self-protection. The strategic consequence was a widening gap between narrative and capability. Decision makers acted as if intelligence confirmed their assumptions when in fact it had been filtered to avoid confrontation with them. Warnings about ammunition depletion, training bottlenecks, and the limits of Western stockpiles were acknowledged privately and ignored publicly. Russia's ability to sustain missile and drone strikes against infrastructure, adapt production, and absorb sanctions was repeatedly underestimated, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. From an analytical standpoint, This is one of the most dangerous intelligence failures a system can produce. When intelligence stops challenging policy, policy stops learning. The war was no longer being assessed as an endurance contest between industrial systems, but as a morality play where resolve substituted for resources. That mindset does not change outcomes, it only delays recognition of them. The hard lesson here is not about Ukraine or Russia alone. It is about what happens when intelligence institutions allow narrative management to override analytic rigor. Once intelligence becomes a tool of reassurance instead of warning, strategic surprise is no longer an accident. It is inevitable. Would you like me to continue with Section 3, the myth of decisive aid? One of the most persistent illusions sold to the public was the idea that Western military aid, properly timed and sufficiently advanced, would deliver a decisive shift on the battlefield. I have watched this claim resurface with every new weapons package, each one marketed as a potential game changer. From an intelligence perspective, this was never a serious assessment. It was a narrative designed to buy time and political consent. Aid matters in wars of endurance, but it does not work the way it was portrayed. It sustains effort. It does not create miracles. The intelligence distortion here lay in confusing tactical effectiveness with strategic transformation. Precision weapons, air defense systems, and long-range strikes did impose costs on Russian forces. That was always true. What they did not do was alter the fundamental structure of the war. Russia adjusted tactics, dispersed assets, hardened infrastructure, and expanded drone and missile production. Ukraine, meanwhile, remained dependent on external supply chains for ammunition, spare parts, and air defense interceptors. Intelligence assessments repeatedly showed that consumption rates far exceeded replenishment, yet public messaging insisted momentum was building. The strategic consequence was predictable: exhaustion masked as progress. Aid was parceled out incrementally, driven by escalation management rather than operational necessity. Training pipelines lagged behind equipment deliveries. Maintenance and logistics became chronic vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Russian forces continued to strike energy infrastructure, transportation nodes, and industrial targets, forcing Ukraine to divert scarce resources to defense and repair rather than offensive action. This was not a failure of courage or competence, it was the math of endurance warfare. From an analytical standpoint, the myth of decisive aid served a political function, not a strategic one. It allowed leaders to avoid confronting the implications of a long war. Industrial mobilization, economic trade-offs, and the possibility that no military solution existed on acceptable terms. Intelligence that pointed in that direction was treated as pessimism rather than warning. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals are trained to recognize, but institutions resist admitting. In wars of endurance, external aid can delay, defeat, or prolong resistance, but it cannot substitute for domestic industrial capacity, manpower depth, and strategic autonomy. Pretending otherwise does not strengthen allies. It traps them inside narratives that collapse under pressure. Would you like me to continue with Section 4, Industrial Reality versus Narrative Power? Every endurance war eventually strips away rhetoric and exposes production. By the time this conflict settled into trench lines and drone swarms, the decisive variable was no longer tactics or training, but industrial throughput. Intelligence reporting made this unmistakable. Artillery consumption ran into tens of thousands of rounds per month. Air defense interceptors were expended faster than they could be replaced. Drones became disposable commodities, not exquisite assets. Russia responded by scaling production, simplifying designs, and accepting lower per unit quality in exchange for volume and speed. Western systems, by contrast, remained optimized for peacetime efficiency and budgetary restraint. Narrative power tried to bridge that gap. It failed. The distortion was subtle but consequential. Public assessments emphasized technological superiority while minimizing production constraints. Intelligence that tracked factory output, supply chains, and workforce capacity was treated as secondary to claims about precision and innovation. Yet wars of endurance reward the side that can replace losses tomorrow, not the side that fields the most advanced system today. Russia's ability to sustain missile and drone strikes repair infrastructure, and keep forces supplied reflected a wartime economic posture that Western analysts were slow to acknowledge. Ukraine's reliance on external production made it vulnerable to political delays, competing priorities, and stockpile depletion. The strategic consequence was an asymmetric endurance curve. Western governments spoke as if time favored them, while intelligence indicators suggested the opposite. Defense industrial bases were slow to expand, constrained by procurement rules, labor shortages, and cost controls. Even when production increased, it lagged behind battlefield demand. Russia, insulated by state control and a willingness to absorb inefficiency, closed the gap faster than expected. This was not a triumph of brilliance, it was a function of priorities. From an analytics standpoint, narrative power proved to be a poor substitute for industrial power. Intelligence warnings about production mismatches were accurate, timely, and largely ignored. Leaders preferred stories about innovation cycles and future breakthroughs to the immediate arithmetic of shells, interceptors, and spare parts. That preference shaped policy choices that extended the war without changing its trajectory. The hard lesson is one intelligence officers learn early and policymakers relearn painfully. In prolonged conflict, the factory is as decisive as the battlefield. When strategy is built on narratives that outpace production, credibility erodes alongside capability. Endurance wars do not reward belief, they reward output. Would you like me to continue with Section V, sanctions, assumptions, and strategic self-deception? Sanctions were sold as the silent weapon that would shorten the war, the pressure mechanism that would fracture Russia's economy and force strategic retreat without further escalation. From an intelligence standpoint, this assumption was always weak. Sanctions work against systems that are structurally dependent, politically brittle, and unprepared for disruption. Russia met none of those criteria. Intelligence reporting prior to the war already showed deep reserves, alternative trade routes, and a political leadership willing to absorb economic pain in exchange for strategic autonomy. Those facts did not disappear. They were simply inconvenient. The distortion occurred when sanctions were framed as decisive rather than conditional. Intelligence assessments that highlighted adaptation, energy rerouting, currency controls, domestic substitution, and expanded trade with non-Western partners were acknowledged quietly and dismissed publicly. Analysts warned that sanctions would degrade Russia over time but not collapse its warfighting capacity. Policymakers preferred a faster narrative. As a result, sanctions became less a strategic tool and more a talking point, cited repeatedly as evidence that time was on the West's side. The strategic consequence was misplaced confidence. While Russia faced inflationary pressure and reduced access to certain technologies, it continued to fund military operations, expand drone and missile production, and sustain logistics. Meanwhile, sanctioning states absorbed secondary costs: energy, price volatility, industrial strain, and political backlash. Intelligence indicators showed that much of the global South viewed sanctions not as law enforcement but as economic warfare, reinforcing skepticism toward U.S.-led financial systems. That reaction was predictable and predicted. From an analytical perspective, this was strategic self-deception layered on top of economic misunderstanding. Sanctions were treated as a substitute for strategy rather than a supporting element. When they failed to deliver rapid results, the response was not reassessment, but escalation: more measures, more claims, fewer questions. Intelligence that should have triggered recalibration instead triggered justification. The hard lesson is blunt. Sanctions are not magic, and intelligence cannot make them so by assertion. When economic tools are oversold, their inevitable limits become strategic liabilities. Credibility erodes not because sanctions fail to hurt, but because leaders promise outcomes those tools were never designed to produce. Would you like me to continue with Section 6, credibility collapse in the Global South? One of the clearest indicators of strategic failure is how quickly your narrative stops traveling. Intelligence reporting over the past several years showed a steady erosion of U.S. credibility across large parts of the Global South, and the Ukraine war accelerated that trend. Governments in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia did not see this conflict through the moral framing promoted in Washington. They saw a prolonged power struggle between blocs, accompanied by economic coercion, selective outrage, and a demand for alignment without reciprocity. Intelligence assessments captured this divergence early. Policy ignored it. The distortion lay in assuming narrative dominance where none existed. U.S. officials spoke as if shared values would override material interests, historical memory, and economic reality. Intelligence reporting from embassies and partner services told a different story. Many states viewed sanctions as destabilizing, food and energy disruptions as unacceptable collateral damage, and Western calls for unity as inconsistent with past behavior. The war was not interpreted as a defensive order, but as another example of rules applied selectively. That perception hardened as the conflict dragged on and promises of quick resolution collapsed. The strategic consequence was isolation disguised as leadership. Voting patterns in international forums, trade realignments, and currency diversification all reflected declining confidence in U.S. judgment. Intelligence indicators showed increased willingness among non-aligned states to hedge, diversify partnerships, and resist pressure. Russia did not need to win hearts. It only needed to demonstrate that Western narratives were not universally accepted. Every exaggerated claim and unmet promise made that easier. From an analytical standpoint, this credibility collapse was entirely foreseeable. Intelligence institutions repeatedly warned that narrative-driven policy would resonate differently outside the transatlantic bubble. Those warnings were treated as peripheral because they challenged the assumption of moral centrality. In reality, endurance wars test credibility as much as capability. When rhetoric outruns results, neutral audiences stop listening. The hard lesson here cuts deeper than any single conflict. Global influence is not sustained by repetition of talking points, but by alignment between claims and outcomes. Intelligence can map perception shifts with precision, but it cannot reverse them once policy ignores reality. Credibility, once spent, does not regenerate on command. Would you like me to continue with Section 7, the hard lesson intelligence refused to learn? The final failure in this war was not tactical, economic, or even diplomatic. It was institutional. Intelligence did its job often enough to make the lesson unmistakable, and leadership refused to absorb it. From the outset, this conflict evolved into a war of endurance, shaped by industrial capacity, societal tolerance for loss, and the ability to adapt faster than narratives could be rewritten. Intelligence reporting reflected that reality with increasing clarity. What collapsed was not access to truth, but the willingness to act on it. I watched the same pattern repeat itself across assessments. Early warnings about attrition were softened. Later confirmations were reframed. Eventually, reality was acknowledged only after it could no longer be denied. Intelligence institutions, under political pressure, drifted from analytic rigor toward narrative maintenance. That drift did not change outcomes, it only delayed recognition of them. Wars of endurance punish delay. They reward adjustment. The United States and its allies adjusted slowly because admitting misjudgment carried political cost. The strategic consequence is a diminished capacity to shape events. Credibility eroded abroad, confidence weakened at home, and allies learned that U.S. narratives were aspirational rather than predictive. Intelligence that should have driven recalibration instead became a post hoc explanation for why expectations were not met. Russia did not need perfect intelligence to exploit this. It only needed to remain consistent, absorb pressure, and let time expose the gap between Western claims and Western capacity. From an analytic standpoint, this is the most damaging lesson of all. Intelligence systems are designed to confront leaders with uncomfortable facts before options narrow. When those systems are repurposed to sustain belief rather than challenge it, they lose their strategic value. Endurance wars do not forgive self-deception. They amplify it. Every month spent defending a failing narrative is a month not spent adjusting strategy. The hard lesson intelligence tried and failed to teach is simple. Power is not proven by statements, aid, announcements, or moral framing. It is proven by alignment between objectives, resources, and time. When intelligence becomes fiction, strategy follows it into collapse. This war did not end American power, but it exposed the cost of refusing to listen to the institutions built to protect it.